Good morning, everybody. I'm Denise White with Colorado Municipal League and want to thank you for joining us today. We are bringing to you today the webinar Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, Informed Solutions, and we've got a great panel here with some great information for you. Before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping items. And so just to our elected officials who are registered here today, you'll receive 1 university credit just for participating in the training. For everyone, we do have everybody's cameras off and you're muted just so we can focus on the presentation materials, but we do welcome your questions. So you'll notice there's a little box that should open up for your GoToWebinar session here with a little orange carrot on it, probably usually in the upper right of your screen. If you click on that carrot, you'll kind of see an option where you can add questions or chat. We'll be watching the questions in chat, and when we get to the Q&A section of our session here today, we will start to bring those up to our panel and get some information for you. We do just have a brief presentation followed by Q&A. I want to remind everybody that we are recording our session today and that we will be posting this recording as well as a slide deck and some other useful links following the training later this week under our training session on cml.org. So enough from me. Without further ado, let's dive into what the material is that you're here for today. Plastic Pollution Reduction Act Informed Solutions. Our presenters today are Rachel Setzke, a Senior Policy and Research Associate with EcoCycle, and we also have Megan Daum, our Vice President of Sustainability at the American Beverage Association. But first, before we get to hear from these two panelists, I'm going to kick this over to Liz Chapman, Executive Director of Recycle Colorado, and she's going to help set the stage a little bit. So Liz, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Denise, and thank you so much for everyone that is here and for those folks that are watching this later. As Denise said, I am Liz Chapman, the Executive Director of Recycle Colorado. If you're not familiar with Recycle Colorado, we are a statewide nonprofit that works towards moving Colorado towards a circular economy. And often that takes the form of increasing and enhancing recycling efforts, which is a big part of what we're doing here today. But it's also about being environmental stewards of the beautiful state we live in. The law that we're talking about today has several components in it. The first component was tied to the first webinar. This is the middle set of 3. The first webinar we did was to focus on the launching of this regulation, which required stores that meet the criteria set forth in the law to charge a 10-cent fee minimum. It can be more than that if your local jurisdiction wants to charge more than 10 cents. That is certainly something that some communities have elected to do. But at a minimum, these retailers have to charge 10 cents for disposable bags. And then those funds get remitted back to the local jurisdiction, whether that's the city or the county, and those funds are used to pay for waste reduction efforts. Today's webinar is focused on another part of that legislation, which removed the preemption that prohibited jurisdictions from regulating plastics within their own jurisdiction. So whether it's a municipality or a county, it used to be that you did not have the right within the state of Colorado to make any regulations that would interfere in the commerce of plastic that contained food, and that preemption has been removed. And so today we're going to talk about what that might mean for your jurisdiction. We're going to go into the pros and cons of adding legislation, other ways to get at those goals. And then a third webinar to come in the future, we're going to offer information to help restaurants comply with another part of this same law that says that schools and retail food establishments may no longer use expanded polystyrene, what you would refer to as styrofoam. They're no longer allowed to use styrofoam beginning in 2024. So we will have a third follow-up webinar to talk about how you as a municipality can support your local businesses in moving to that no styrofoam model. But today we're talking about what are the options for municipalities now that that preemption has been removed. We have got a couple of experts here that know a whole lot about recycling. Rachel in particular is going to kick it off because not only does she know recycling, but she also knows policy surrounding recycling. So Rachel Setzke from EcoCycle, I will turn it over to you and then I'll let you turn it back to Megan, and then Megan back to you, and then we'll go to our audience for questions.
Sounds good. I'm just waiting for this. There we go. There's slides. So introduction slide. Liz did a great job introducing us, so we can move right into the next slide. For those of you who don't know who EcoCycle is, just briefly, EcoCycle is one of the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit recyclers. We are also one of the oldest zero waste advocates in the country. We operate the Boulder County Recycling Center, the Center for Hard to Recycle Materials in Boulder, or CHARM. We obviously have a policy department. The department I work in, we work in state and municipal, local level policies. And we also have a schools department, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Next slide. So Liz did a great job giving an introduction to the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, or HB 21-1162. It was a few years in the making. It took a few years to get passed, but it finally did pass in 2021. I think you're probably all familiar with the piece that's already been implemented, which is that bag fee, statewide single-use bag fee on both paper and plastic bags. As Liz said, some places have gone above that fee, some places have expanded the retailers that applies to, but at the very least, every large store in Colorado should be collecting a 10-cent bag fee. And by large store, there's a specific definition in the bill, which was talked about during the last webinar. It's basically any store that has more than 3 locations in Colorado or has locations outside of Colorado as well as inside of the state. Starting in January 2024, January 21st, 2024, that bag fee will continue on paper bags, but all single-use plastic bags at those same retailers will be prohibited. An exemption to that prohibition, unless your municipality has broadened the definition of retailers affected, is that restaurants will not be prohibited from giving out plastic bags. Obviously, for the sake of reducing plastic waste, we hope they'll find other alternatives, but they are not prohibited in this law. The thing that is prohibited is the use of polystyrene takeout containers or cups. In the original bill, the green section of this slide, you see, and you may remember that the bag fee had to be remitted to the municipality by April of 2024. There was a bill that was passed this year, HB 1285. It deleted that deadline. So what that means for municipalities is that if your municipality or your county is set up to receive those funds, that you can start reaching out to retailers at this point and just say, on a quarterly basis, please remit everything you've collected since January 1st, and then quarterly thereafter. You don't have to wait until 2024, which will help those retailers that were concerned about tax implications of carrying over that fee past the calendar year. That bill also made another important distinction. If you are a business in a jurisdiction that is not set up to take that bag fee money, it now allows those businesses to retain the full 10 cents and to spend that 10 cents in the way originally proposed by the bill. So basically investing in recycling or compost or waste diversion activities within their business. And one of those includes they can use that money to purchase reusable bags for free distribution to customers. And then finally, as Liz said, the last piece of PPRA, or 1162, we'll probably refer to it both ways, the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. The last piece of that is the July 1st, 2024 deadline that lifts the preemption on plastic ordinances. So that opens the door for municipalities, for local governments to have one more, and that's really important, one more tool to reduce plastics. And what our conversation today is about is there's actually always been quite a few different ways, different levers that municipalities have. This is just one that seems sometimes the shiniest, maybe easiest, even though that might not be true. So I'm gonna hand it over to Megan to talk a little bit about another very important bill that's related to this. Well, law that's related to this, and then we'll come back and talk about some of those approaches to plastic reduction.
Thanks, Rachel, so much. Just waiting for the slide and then I will start. So I thought, a way for us to start was to kind of just like pull back and talk about what is EPR. And I'm referring to HB 22-1355, which was signed into law by the governor in 2022. But basically just what is EPR? So EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, is a policy, and what it does is it really just shifts the responsibility for what happens to packaging and printed paper at its end of life from local governments and taxpayers to the producers who create them and put them on the marketplace, so that producers are funding and operating the system in order to achieve efficiency and environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. So recycling today is generally a linear system, which I'm sure all of you know. Producers make and sell products to consumers who use and dispose of them. And then municipalities are primarily responsible for collection, and based on many different factors, including education, system inefficiencies, lack of investments in collection, separation and processing technology, and even non-existent systems, too many materials never get recycled and no one's held responsible. Next slide, please. So under well-designed EPR, there's what's called a producer responsibility organization, and that's really the linchpin. It's a privately run nonprofit organization, which is important that this is a nonprofit, and it's made up of the consumer brands who put packaging and printed paper on the market. So you're thinking your Coca-Cola's, your L'Oreal, your Clorox, all the above, all the products that you have, that you see in the supermarket. And those companies are then responsible for operating and funding the entire recycling system, from education to collection to processing, and they're kind of incentivized to look at the system from 30,000 feet and optimize that education access, hauling, routing, processing, and more. The fees to run the system are assessed by materials and then further eco-modulated to incentivize environmental factors like recyclability of materials. The PRO, or Producer Responsibility Organization, will reimburse local governments and private haulers for a reasonable cost of service, and service standards will be set. And investments will then be made throughout the system. And like I said, all the way from consumer education to access to collection to MRF infrastructure to collect and process more materials for sale in commodity markets back to producers. This results in producers having greater access to recycled materials. And with that increased supply of material, producers can and will use recycled content in their packaging, which right now is really important because we've had 4 minimum content laws passed in the US so far, and I imagine there will be a number more, which basically by law requires that specifically plastic, also other materials, but all of them include plastic, that you're increasing the recycled content in packaging. And so that we obviously need more material flowing through the system. But while this system is operated and funded by the private sector, government has a really important role. Government provides oversight, government ensures transparency and accountability in the system. And ultimately, government is the one who approves the PRO plan. And in this case, I'm talking about CDPHE. So CDPHE approves the PRO plan. They are also designated the PRO, which they've already done, which Rachel knows a lot more than I do about, which we can get into. But CDPHE has kind of anointed Circular Action Alliance as the nonprofit PRO for the state of Colorado. And then the government also approves the plan and the targets, which is important. And I think that's good for that. So next slide, please. So thank you. So far, we've had 4 laws passed in the United States, Maine, Oregon, California, and Colorado. But we've seen EPR introduced in a lot of states across the country, and I think we'll just continue to see more and more of these laws be introduced. And so there's really, there's a good deal of difference between good EPR and kind of not great EPR. And so if we could please go to the next slide. Just pointing out some of the key differences between the laws that have already passed. That, certain ones, for example, Maine and California do not include printed paper, which I think is an oversight and a mistake, especially considering that, I don't know about you, but the majority of my recycling bin is mixed paper. And so in Maine and California, then the producers of printed paper won't be required to participate or pay into the system. And so either those costs will be borne by the other producers, or that municipalities will still continue to have to pay for the portion of paper recycling, which kind of defeats the purpose, in my opinion. There's also differences in terms of scope of funding and coverage. So in Maine and Colorado, you have this kind of full model where you're looking at the entire system, whereas in Oregon and California, you're building on what already exists, and the law focuses on improvements. And I think, for example, the state of Oregon, that makes sense. In California, where there is already a lot of infrastructure on the ground, and that was kind of the compromise made there. Then recycling targets, how those are set, differs by state, who sets them. Some are set in statute, some are set in law. I mean, some are set by the department, some are set in statute, and then some are set later by the pro based on the plan. Of course, always approved by the CDPHE or the government. And then the number of pros and pro autonomy. So just pointing out that there's a big difference between what I would argue are good and not so great EPR laws. And then the very last slide, please. And like I said, Rachel is the real expert in Colorado here, so I will just say this a little bit, which is there's a really high level timeline of Colorado's EPR, which is not ERP, but EPR. So I'm noticing that is a typo, which I apologize for, and I will make sure that's fixed in the deck that goes out. But this is the basic timeline that the pro forums, which has already been done, CDPHE anointed Circular Action Alliance. So that's going really well. And then there will be the needs assessment, which is finalized. All producers have to kind of come under the pro umbrella, and then the pro begins to implement the plan. So that's the kind of high level overview of EPR and a little bit about the specifics of Colorado, and I'll pass it back to Rachel for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. So one of the important things, why these two bills go together, they're both about packaging, obviously, that's pretty upfront. They're both also about how do we get rid of some of the worst plastics, and how do we incentivize plastic package, or how do we incentivize all packaging to be more recyclable, to be more circular? In the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, we're trying to get rid of those plastic bags that are they're tremendously polluting. They end up blowing into our beautiful wilderness areas. They end up being eaten by wildlife. They clog our recycling machines. With successful EPR laws like Megan was talking about, we actually see incentives to make packaging that is more recyclable and get rid of some of the worst packaging. Often, one of the types of packaging that's targeted by EPR laws is polystyrene, which we've already taken care of in Colorado, or some polystyrene we've taken care of in Colorado through PPRA. So they really do go well together. And another thing I want to underscore about Megan's last slide is when we say that producer responsibility in Colorado will start to be implemented in 2026, what that means is the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, funded by all these companies that she mentioned and more, they are going to be funding free access to all Coloradans for recycling. If you're in a rural community, that might be drop-off center, but if you're somewhere where your trash collection is on your curbside, that's going to be curbside recycling. So we need to keep that in mind as we think about our goals for pollution reduction with packaging. Is yes, it would be great if all packaging went away, but that's not realistic, because packaging does wonders for us. It saves food waste. It gets our materials to our houses. So that's not a realistic goal. The better goal is, what packaging do we need? What packaging is really useful? What packaging is the least damaging to our environment, to our economies, and what's the most sustainable? So if we can go to the next slide, please. All right. One more thing before we dive into the next phases of Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. I was asked to add a slide that talked a little bit about these bag fees that have already started rolling into some municipalities. And we have, I believe it's somewhere between 10 and 20 municipalities that have bag ordinances even before the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act in Colorado. And they vary from being straight out bans to the city I live in is Louisville, and we have either a 20 or 25 cent tax that voters voted on and approved. So there's kind of a gamut of approaches to how those early adopted ordinances went into place. And in these communities, some trends that we've seen is that you see the municipality tends to see a lot more money in the first year than they do in subsequent years. And that's really actually the goal of the program. I can tell you that the city of Steamboat Springs, their first year, they saw about $170,000 in bag fee revenue. By the next year, it was 120-ish thousand. That's a big drop, but really that's a success, because the goal of these fees is not to make money. I mean, it's a nice bonus, you get money to invest in stuff, but the real goal of these fees is to help drive behavior change, to help people figure out that, you know what, I can use a reusable bag, and that's actually in some cases easier than having a plastic bag that might develop a hole and spill my groceries all over. Another thing I wanted to point out on this slide, it's got a lot of text, sorry, that we see trends in how municipalities tend to use the money from bag fees. Almost all municipalities nationwide that have some sort of a bag fee, they're using that for administering the program, doing education about the program, providing free reusable bags to the community. Often those are targeted at lower income homes, but they also are broadly distributed. They, I think my hometown bag says Louisville's a cool town or something like that. And I can also say, just as an aside, our bag fee went into place on December 1st of last year. And sorry, not December 1st, January 1st of last year, 2 days after the Marshall Fire. So we had this devastating fire, and then we also had this brand new piece of ordinance go into effect. And yeah, there was some complaint about it, but it rolled out, and it's now working fairly well. I see fewer and fewer people purchasing bags at the grocery store. More and more have their reusable bags. That success happened in large part because even our mayor was bringing boxes of reusable bags to stores. We gave away thousands of bags at the Disaster Recovery Center after the fire. So a lot of just public engagement to get the program rolling well is what helped make it happen well. Back to the ways that municipalities are spending these funds, in addition to specifically around the administration of bag fee programs, they're also investing in recycling programs. Some are actually purchasing infrastructure like containers for recycling. A number of communities are using these funds for community cleanups or collection events like a spring cleanup kind of day. And again, in Louisville and I think some other towns, they're actually using the money to support green businesses through grants and other sustainability programs to help invest them or give them some seed funding to do sustainability efforts that they're wanting to do. And then this last piece in here was just talking about the 1285 fix that I'm happy to try to answer questions about later, but I think I've pretty much said what was in that bill. That bill was a very short one, just cleaning up those two financial pieces. Next slide, please. So as we move forward with the rest of this presentation, thinking about what are our options for reducing pollution, packaging pollution. Plastic pollution, packaging pollution, all of it goes together. The first step anytime you're doing any sort of ordinance or goal or ordinance or program is to really think about what are your goals? What are your community's goals? In this case, is your goal simply to eliminate plastic? Again, that's a good goal, but there's a lot of plastic that makes life, what we have. My headphones are plastic, my computer's plastic. There's a lot of plastic that we're simply not going to get rid of anytime soon. So think about which plastics. I've got straws because they're kind of the ubiquitous, like lots of people can get behind getting rid of straws in most cases. Or are your goals to reduce overall waste? Again, maybe it's not just the plastics, maybe there's more packaging that you're thinking about, or other types of items like single-use forks or ketchup, just little packages of ketchup. Are you trying to support reuse systems, which we'll talk about later? Are you prolonging the lifespan of your local landfill? That's been the driver for a number of communities, is we need to do better recycling, more composting, plastic reduction, because our landfill is nearing its end. And we know that's really expensive to build out another cell or to have to open an entirely new landfill. Are you trying to help businesses save money and have more environmental options? Are you trying to make it easier for customers and residents to make more environmental choices? And then, of course, this last bullet on here is other. There might be something driving your community that is just a really, something that's kind of the life of your community, that's something that's important to folks there that the rest of us outside of your community would never think of. So think really hard about what are the goals that you're trying to meet. And those goals, next slide, please. Those goals may vary depending on who your stakeholders are. Your residents might have one goal, your elected officials or your town staff might have another. Sometimes those goals don't mesh, and sometimes they come together beautifully. Elected officials and staff might realize that the landfill's getting near its end, and residents might be saying, we really want to reduce our organic waste. That's beautiful, it goes together. So see, there might be some synergies there. As you're thinking through who are your stakeholders, I just put some very common ones in here. Youth, a lot of the plastic reduction acts in Colorado, like the Louisville bag fee, the steamboat bag fee, a number of the bag ordinances have been driven by youth. They have been the ones that have gone and testified to their local town councils. They've gone out on street corners with signs. They have been the ones behind a lot of these bills or ordinances, sorry. Just general residents, us older folks do things too, not just our kids. Businesses, community groups. So think about who are the community groups in your area. They might be churches or non-denominational groups. They might be neighborhood associations. So think about which groups are really kind of the movers and shakers. Local government staff might be the ones driving it, or elected leaders, or there might be some sort of combination. Hopefully there's a combination of these stakeholders that are really interested in making a change. Next slide, please. All right, and now to dig into the approaches. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, this PPRA passed in 2021, and a couple of our forward-thinking municipalities in Colorado have already started looking at or even adopting ordinances in Colorado that'll kick into place once that July date comes around next year. Telluride was the first, Breckenridge was another one, and there's some similarities. Both of those bills kind of have a feel of a skip the stuff sort of bill, like is one that Denver passed even before 1162. A skip the stuff bill is simply a bill that says restaurants, rather than just automatically giving out single-use items, they ask first, or they have customers ask first. So instead of just throwing that handful of plastic forks in your bag, they wait for the customer to say, may I have a plastic fork? Or they ask the customer proactively, do you need forks with your order? So that saves money and expense for the restaurant, and it also saves those of us who have a collection of plastic forks in the drawer from getting even more of them. So far these bills kind of have that flavor to them, and they go a little further in some cases. Next slide, please. Oop, you want one too many. There you go. Other ordinances to think about. These are the types of ordinances that have actually always been allowed. The PPRA is not, but doesn't have an effect on them. But think about how can your municipal government or your local government, how can you lead by example? So you might have purchasing policies that prohibit the use of local government dollars on single-use items. So one example would be, if we have a city council meeting, we're not going to do bottled water. We're going to have pitchers of water and reusable cups. That's a pretty easy one. I will say, if you're looking at a bill like that, make sure that you include an exemption for emergencies. Again, in Louisville, after the fire, there was a lot of single-use water that had to be distributed. There were also very large recycling bins that were put out for those of us who wanted to recycle our single-use water. But just make sure that you've got that exemption in there. Purchasing policies can also be put in place that support recycled content, such as purchasing waste bins that have, like Megan was talking about, a certain amount of recycled content in them. And all of these links, you'll get the slide deck, and these are all links to actual ordinances or articles. Avon and Walking Mountain Science Center have put together a really great events policy that requires vendors to use specific types of packaging so that they know that what they're using fits within their zero waste guidelines. And I will say they can do compostable packaging in their areas. I know that's not true for a lot of the state. So if you're looking at those guidelines, just keep that in mind, that the certified compostable packaging is acceptable in their area. And then also a building code update to require bottle filling stations. Anywhere drinking fountain is required. So a lot of municipalities have requirements to include drinking fountains in new buildings. Why not have a bottle fill station there as well? And I'm sure there's other purchasing or high-level leadership type example ordinances. Actually, folks can think about them. I'd love to hear them. I'd love to keep adding to this toolkit. Next slide, please. So I talked a little earlier about reuse. Reuse is a huge deal. We can dramatically reduce the amount of packaging, reduce the amount of stuff we have if we turn towards reuse. And reuse can be simple. Reuse or repair can be as simple as, do you have a local shoe repair store? Or do you have a tailor in town, that maybe a dry cleaner and tailor that helps people mend their clothes? Do you have those systems in place? Does your library have a maker space in it? Are there those systems? Are there businesses that are already doing reuse? And are you celebrating those? The map on here is one that actually EcoCycle staff maintains. And we try to show off that there are all the thrift stores of the various different materials in the Boulder area. So thrift is another great reuse option. And you probably, I would think, have some sort of thrift store in your area that, if we can support those businesses, that's great. That's reducing the amount of new stuff that is being created. Some municipalities are ready to delve a little deeper into reuse. These are just a couple, Deliver Zero and Our Cup are just a couple examples of businesses that are actively working with municipalities in Colorado to bring reuse items into public venues. So whether it's an event venue where they're selling lots of beverages and Our Cup, they get these reusable cups, you fill them, you drink your beer or your soda at your concert, and then you drop them in a bin on your way out the door, and they get washed and reused and at the next concert. Deliver Zero, same kind of idea, though they are for your takeout food. When you go to a restaurant, you get your food in it, you take it home, you eat it, you take it back and drop it off. Deliver Zero comes, they clean it, and then they bring the restaurant back their clean carry-out containers for next time. Like I said, there are two examples of many businesses that are doing this, and some municipalities are working to help get these types of businesses going in their municipalities. Next slide, please. So I already talked a little bit about water fill stations, but they're just they seem like the easiest entryway into reduction. So many municipalities have installed reuse or refill stations, at your rec centers, at your libraries, other places. But can you take it one step further? And are you taking it one step further? Are you celebrating those? Are you really pointing out Colorado has amazing water? It's some of the best water in the country. I'm a local, so, I say that. But like the town of Basalt here has a great website or web page talking about how great their local water is and about how you should use the refill station. Town of Breck here has this online map that you can zoom into to figure out where in town are refill stations. So if I'm a tourist and I have my water bottle, but I don't know where to fill it, I can just get on this easy to use map and, I just need to walk a block and there I go. Another thing Breckenridge has done is they have used some of their bag fee funds and some tourism dollars to buy these mobile water refill stations, because they realize that they have enough events in town that even with their map and their in place water refill, that's not always enough. And so they've brought in these refill stations that are mobile and they can reposition them as needed through events. Next, please. All right, here's one near and dear to my heart, because we do have our schools program that works on educating youth in the Boulder Valley and St. Vrain Valley school districts. We know that one of the best ways to drive behavior change is to educate children. We know this, especially as parents, because our kids come home and tell us what we're doing wrong and how to do it right. So if we can teach our kids about reuse and reduction, that's a really key way to help spread that message throughout the community. We also know that by supporting reuse in schools, we can actually save school districts money. We know that bulk milk dispensers, when they're paired with reusable cups, they can cut down on not only the packaging waste from cartons, but actually on the amount of money that schools are spending on milk, because kids, instead of getting a full carton that they drink half of, maybe they'll just have half a glass and they'll drink what they've taken. They're more likely to drink what they've taken. There's a source here from the Chef Ann Foundation. If I remember correctly, I think there were some resources on that page about subsidies for getting reuse into schools. Another idea is about reusable trays and utensils. When I asked our schools department at EcoCycle what would be their #1 recommendation, they said the switching to the reusable trays and utensils cuts down on so much expense of having to buy disposables for those things. And it's pretty easy to set up a system at the end of the cafeteria for kids to learn where the reuse goes, where the trash goes. There is needed continued investment for staff to maintain that and for dishwashers. But again, there are agencies that provide some funding for reuse in schools. And finally, the last piece on here, like I've mentioned a few times now, we have our schools department at EcoCycle, and this is their free schools guide that has all sorts of different ideas of activities that school districts can use to both teach about reuse and reduction, but also things they can implement that can help save on single-use items, save on things that they're having to buy. So next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to wrap this back up, coming back to the PPRA directly. In December of last year, EcoCycle realized that while there were some municipalities that were already putting together educational materials on how to do outreach about the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, that there was no concerted statewide effort that wasn't part of the bill to ask CDPHE or anyone else to do all the education. And so we scrambled. We spent about 2 weeks, a whole lot of overtime, putting together this free toolkit for municipalities and for businesses to use to educate consumers and businesses about what the bag fee meant. We're working currently on phase 2, and I'm very excited to say, if you go to the next slide, we're about a week away from the launch of our alternatives to polystyrene tool that we have tried to make. These are just a couple samples of the pages. We've tried to make it so it applies statewide. And the reason for the challenge there is we know that statewide guidelines for recycling and compost are very different from area to area, and sometimes with different haulers within one municipality. So we've tried to make it as broad as possible by putting some caveats in here. And of course, this toolkit has been brought to you by generous funding from some communities. Happy to have more communities help us fund it, and those communities that are funding it, we will personalize the toolkit for so that it has the specific correct guidelines. The approach that this tool has is we have, as you can see on the left, laid out different types of containers that can be used instead of polystyrene for various types of food, going from the best choice, which is reusables, to the worst choice, which is things to avoid because they're toxic. The polystyrene, black plastics, and actually we have a couple other plastics that have been added to the avoid column as well. And then of course in the middle there's the recyclables and the compostables if that's possible in your area. We also have a section of the toolkit that talks about accessories. They're not covered under the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act per se. They're not part of the ban, but there's some really simple behaviors that restaurants can adopt that can save them money by reducing the amount of materials that they are handing out for free. So a guide to that. And then the third part of the toolkit talks about how did we land on our best to worst decisions. It gives a little bit more background information on the recyclability of certain materials, the toxicity of some materials, and some other criteria that we used. Next slide, please. And that's it for me. That is my the PPRA, the ecocycle.org/PPRA is where you will find that free toolkit, and we're hoping within a week or so we will have the polystyrene piece loaded. And of course, Rachel at EcoCycle, that's my email. Feel free to send me an email if you've got more questions. I think we can stop sharing and start chatting. I think you're on mute.
How long have we been doing this? Thank you so much for sharing such great information. We know there's a lot for people to digest. It kind of comes in fast and furious in that webinar session. So we are open to questions now, Q&A time. So again, you can put those into the question box and I will watch those and I'll bring them up to Rachel, Megan, and Liz is joining us again in case there's something she can field quickly. But this time is yours to ask questions as members and get some opinions and some information from our experts. So we do have a question that I can kick you off with. We have a question coming in about, do you have any examples of any ordinances for grocery or grocery-like businesses to offer bulk items for refill?
Ordinances that would require bulk?
They're not specific on that in the question, but I think if we could just talk, like, you know, when you look at the water refill stations, it's kind of like bulk
Right.
water, right? Do you see anything in the communities or have you seen anything where there's a move for that, or whether it's volunteer or city ordinance that kind of is rotated around that bulk item?
I wish I had a better answer because that's something that's on my plate to delve more into the ordinances around reuse, but we know that we're seeing an uptick in reuse businesses. I can say, just since I'm in the Boulder area, I know we've got Nude Foods that operates a system where you actually buy stuff in their jars, bring it home, you use it up, you take the jars back, you get a deposit back. So that's one method of bulk. We also have other more traditional bulk places that are, you know, you bring your own container and you pull down the lever and the dispenser fills up your container with nuts or seeds or whatever it is that you're getting. So there definitely are bulk stores, and they're growing in slowly but surely throughout the state. There are definitely requirements and code, and that's what we're trying to understand better, is what is the code at the state level as well as what are codes at local levels that are allowing or prohibiting the use of bulk. And so that's something that we are wanting to delve more into. I don't know if Liz, if you know any more, since Liz comes from the other side of the mountains originally, she might have some West Slope expertise. I don't know.
All right, digging for the unmute. To my knowledge, there are not any communities that have regulated through ordinance the use of bulk. However, it does bring to mind some experience I had in Aspen. Whenever municipalities can go to businesses and say, we have this new way of doing things that will save you money and be a more environmentally responsible choice, it's pretty easy to get buy-in without necessarily legislating it. And bulk strikes me as one of those targets. The costs that are incurred with single use or limited use quantities are much higher than what's involved with having consumers bring in their own container and then refill it. I know that there are some beverage companies, and Megan might want to chime in, that are experimenting with reuse and refill. And I don't know that they're doing it in Colorado. I know they're doing it in some other places. Do you know of any of that going on at the brand scale, Megan?
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for that question, which is a great one. So for those of you who don't know, I represent the non-alcoholic beverage industry. So your Coke, Pepsi, Keurig Dr. Pepper, Red Bull, all those drinks without the booze. So I know it's a kind of like, I know that all the companies individually are working really hard behind the scenes to figure out how to crack the nut on reuse refill. And I find that it's like really exciting. And I know that the challenge has been so far scale. And I think that that makes sense. And I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from both you, Rachel and Liz, is that this, scaling. And I think that we want to be careful about how we do that we want to avoid unintended consequences. For example, if you're just like shipping like refillable plastic all over the country and it's, actually not being reused and just being trashed, like that's not a good story. So we're trying to be really careful about how we are approaching the Ellen MacArthur 4 quadrants with regard to reuse refill, and those are reuse at home and on the go, and refill at home and on the go. And anybody who wants to talk further about those, I'm happy to go into detail for sure.
I can say along the lines of the reuse or refill with beverages, something we want to be careful with, and I may not have made it super clear, but you know, if your options in a restaurant are to sell a can of Coke or to have a fountain drink dispenser, which is reuse, or you know, it is refill, but then if you're using plastic lined paper cups that have to be landfilled, you know, the reuse option there might not be, you know, it's not necessarily the better option. If all of your fountain drinks are going into refillable, reusable plastic cups that then you collect and you wash them and then you reuse them, you know, 50, 100 times before they finally get crushed by, you know, whatever, whatever would finally break them, then that fountain drink actually is a better solution. But you have to weigh those pros and cons of those things. Another option is, I know it is legal in Colorado to allow customers to bring in their own refillable cups. Mine goes with me everywhere I go. It's been to many of your towns, I'm sure, everywhere I go. And that's not true in other states. You know, my husband and I joke that every time we go on an airplane, not that we go that often, but we take our cups and then we'll end up at a state that we think is as green or greener than Colorado. And then they're like, yeah, we can't use your cup. I'm like, what? We're just gonna go home and do staycations. So that is something that's allowable. And definitely, like Liz said, doesn't need to be an ordinance. That's a money saving practice for businesses.
Great. So we do have another question, and if we're ready to kind of move into that. Can either the bag fees or producer responsibility funds be used to subsidize plastic recycling, either at a drop-off location or private curbside companies such as Ridwell? And let me know if you need me to read that again.
The question was, could the bag fees or the producer responsibility
funds be used to subsidize plastic recycling?
So the bag fees, they have to be used by the jurisdiction or the business for recycling, composting, waste reduction. So yeah, a drop-off center would fall within, when drafting that bill, we intentionally made it pretty broad so that it could be flexible how it was used. The funds from producer responsibility, those funds will all go to that independent nonprofit organization. And that nonprofit organization, they, as Megan said, they're just about to announce what contractors are going to be doing a statewide needs assessment. So that's my other little plug. If you don't know in your community sort of a rough idea of what's going on as far as recycling access and what would we love to see, how could that be better in our community, please, in the next few weeks, start digging into that, because as that needs assessment, it's only 3 months, it's going to go super fast. And it's going to try and figure out what in Colorado needs to be done to make sure that there is access for people to get recycling. And then from that needs assessment, the producer responsibility organization, they're going to put together a very long, detailed plan, and then they are actually going to be funding the system. There's an important piece in between there is that the state will actually sign off on their plan and say, yes, we think you're going the right direction. And even before the state gets to sign off on it, there's a volunteer board, advisory board, that Liz happens to be the chair of, that represent experts from all different angles, municipalities, from environmental nonprofits, and then there's an environmental justice. There's all different experts looking at the plan from different angles to sign off on it. And then that's where those funds will go. They'll go into implementing the plan.
Great. And we had one kind of comment come in. I think it's related to some of that bulk, but I'll just share it as an idea, is that breweries often use reusable containers, and that's part of their marketing to get return customers. So I think we've seen some examples, somebody sharing there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another question we've got is, how have local food producers responded to the plastic bag ban, especially in communities where composting is not available? For example, compostable bags are not sensible, is the comment there. So looking at how local food producers are responding to that plastic bag ban.
I'm not sure, Denise, that I understand the connection between a food producer and the plastic bag ban. Do they mean when I hear the word food producer, I think of a farmer. I think of a dairy cattle. I'm not sure that's what the question is aiming for. Can you clarify?
Yes, they send in clarification, thinking farmers.
Thinking farmers. Okay. Rachel, I don't know of anybody responding to that. By and large, food producers don't make much use of single-use plastic bags because they are shipping their produce in bulk. There is a component at the statewide farmers markets, and maybe that's what the question is getting at. And statewide at the farmers markets, I believe there's an exemption for that. Isn't that?
So yeah, so if you're talking about, you know, a single-use bag that's full of potatoes and comes sealed up, and when I go to my local grocery store, I get this Colorado potatoes single-use bag. It is a single-use bag. Those are not the bags that are being targeted. These are checkout bags. And so for the most part, a producer of food they're not going to be affected by the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. The one exception I could think of to that is a town. I'm sorry, I never remember if it's a town or a city, but Steamboat Springs, they widened their retailers to include farmers markets. So that's the one exception I can think of that local farmers or might be affected. But again, that saves them from having to buy a whole, you know, however many dozens of rolls of plastic bags they go through every year at the farmers market stand, and it encourages us, those of us who go to farmers markets, to bring our backpack or our cloth bags or whatever. So it's that behavior change piece again, and it's actually saving money for those local producers. I will say though, the producer responsibility law, that's where you get into those prepackaged items. And again, though, Colorado agriculture, because of the exemptions in the law for smaller producers, actually, I don't think there's any Colorado agriculture that's going to be affected by it. It's going to be your big producers, your Cokes, your Pepsis, you know.
And I would add to that, Rachel, that I know Telluride and Aspen both have city policies that prohibit petroleum plastic at their farmers markets, but that's city by city. That is not included in the statewide legislation that we're discussing today. It is within the purview of a county or a city to create that law if they would like to, but it's not regulated as part of the statewide law. And Rachel touched on something that I think is important when you're thinking about, and Megan as well, when you're thinking about bulk and you're converting from very thin plastic containers to more durable plastic containers, it's really important that those durable plastic containers are reused, reused, and reused. If a big chunky piece of plastic replaces a thin piece of plastic for a single use, we're actually going in the wrong direction. And consumer behavior really falls into that. And I think that one of the things that Rachel and I are seeing across Colorado, and why she used the word scaffolding, is something the municipality can do is help bring their citizen base slowly into this new universe of thinking about bringing your bag everywhere, bringing your cup everywhere, bringing your leftover container everywhere. And that's not something that happens overnight, and municipalities don't necessarily need to legislate that for their citizenry, but they can support that behavior by modeling it in internal policies, by working with restaurants and showcasing those food service and other retail establishments that are supporting those programs. And everybody appreciates a little extra advertising, and everybody appreciates something that saves them money, but it only saves them money if it's full circle. It only works if everybody involved in the system is making sure that the system is functioning the way it's intended. and not taking these significantly bulkier, more durable goods and just using them once and throwing them away. And that's a hard behavior to shift.
And I will say, the scaffolding is a great analogy, because if any of you on this webinar think about it, I mean, you start using your reusable bag, well, then the cup seems pretty easy. And then, oh, I can just stick some reusable utensils in my purse or my backpack. And, oh, it's pretty easy then to put a takeout container in my backpack, which is by state law allowable. So if you've got your leftovers, instead of having them bring you a polystyrene or whatever takeout container, you scrape your leftovers into your own container. That is legal under state law. You can't give your box to a restaurant, someone at a restaurant and have them do it. You have to do it yourself, but that is legal to do that. So there's all these little things that then, people start thinking like, oh, where else can I just cut out a little bit of pollution or a little bit of plastic, or just waste in general. And so you can, there's plenty of hashtags, there's plenty of ways that you can kind of gamify it and make it exciting. This is actually Plastic Free July. I don't know if that was intentional to host this webinar this month, but lots of things going around nationally and actually internationally as well, because it is Plastic Free July. So lots of webinars that people are visiting and thinking about, how can I reduce my plastic?
Great. And I'm going to say, yes, it was intentional. Whether that's the truth or not, I won't confess, but so, I think we've got time for a couple more questions, since I do have one in queue. And then if anybody else has any last questions they want to get in before our time today comes to a close, please get it into that question box. But can one of you, and maybe Megan, this is more you, but can you help explain how the PRO is formed and how companies are appointed to that nonprofit?
Yeah, that's it. I will start, and then of course Rachel is the Colorado native, and I will pass to her. But just like writ large, the way it is that if you are a producer, and Rachel very wisely pointed out that there are de minimis exceptions, which I had neglected to say, and that's a really important piece here, that very small businesses and local businesses will not be included in this program, and that's fair, and that's purposeful. But for the larger, like the Clorox, L'Oreal's, Cokes, Pepsi's, all of these very large companies, you are required by law to be part of this producer organization. There is no like, cool, don't feel like it. Like that's not, you can't do that. Like that you have to come underneath the PRO by the time the plan is implemented. So I hope that answers the first piece, at least, is that you're mandated by law to be part of it. And then Denise, what was the other part of the question? Can you remind me?
And so it's how are companies appointed to that nonprofit? So I think there's the law. I don't know if I'm reading into this, and this person looks like they're still online, so you can add some clarity if you want. But whether that's, can we opt in? Can we get a seat at the table? Is it law? Like, just speak a little more to that, maybe.
Yeah, you are compelled by the law, but I'll pass to Rachel to see if she is maybe.
So yeah, but it is a nonprofit, and so it was formed. The law passed just over a year ago. And so it was formed, I think the number was by an initial 16 companies that came together, and they put in money up front voluntarily. They were like, this is happening, and we want to make sure it happens right. And so these 16 companies, big companies, started putting it together and thinking about how does this work. They reached out to all sorts of, Recycle Colorado, EcoCycle, municipalities, trying to figure out what does this look like? What does this bill mean? They working with the state. In, I believe it was April, the state of Colorado allowed for nonprofit PRO organizations to apply to be the official PRO for the state. And at that point, this one, Circular Action Alliance, CAA, they were chosen by the state. There were two that applied and one that was chosen. And so they continue to work and really reach out to stakeholder groups. I was on a call yesterday with a bunch of people and them, and I'm going to a call in an hour with a bunch of people and them. So they are just reaching out to everyone they can to try to understand, what does it look like in Colorado? And so that original group, that's their national board, and they are creating a Colorado specific board as well. And I'm not exactly sure the process of getting onto that board, but I know that they're looking for Colorado businesses, because they really do want it to be a system and a group of organizations that really understand what our recycling context is, what our business context is. They really want to understand Colorado. So Megan or Liz, if either of you off the top of your heads know their website, or we can put it in the information after this, because they really are trying to gather as much input as they can so that they can move forward in a way that really meets the needs of the state. And one piece that I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the needs assessment and the plan, at multiple stages throughout the process, there is time for public input. The advisory board meets once a month, and there's time for public comment during each of those meetings. And then at the big milestone decision-making points, they're going to be asking for, the CDPHE is going to be asking for public stakeholder feedback. So please be part of the process and help us make sure that this is a law that really rolls out in the way we want it to.
Great. And I think one quick clarifier on that, it does sound like the person responded that you've answered it, but had a quick clarifier. It's like, so this sounds like that each state has their own PRO, their own pro?
That is a really good question. So what has happened so far is Circular Action Alliance has formed with the goal of being the nonprofit pro for each of the 4 states so far that have passed. So they individually applied to Colorado, who was kind of first out of the gate in terms of appointing who the pro would be. They will apply for Maine, Oregon, and California, and then assumingly all the other laws that come online. And so they'll kind of be this national pro body that will then have state-based boards, et cetera. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Which is great for the community and sharing lessons. It's very smart.
Right. And that kind of, I think as Rachel referred to, we can find a link to that and add that into the materials we'll be sending out. And we have just kind of hit our 60 minutes on this. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you again to our presenters, Rachel, Megan, Liz. This has been awesome to get your input and your expertise on this. Thank you to our attendees for your great questions and just for being here today to help move everything forward. If you were unable to get a question answered in the time allotted, we will be sending out some follow-up material with contact links, and so I'm sure anybody will be able to connect with you and hopefully try to get some of those questions answered if you couldn't get them answered today. We will have this webinar downloaded with the support materials, and we'll be getting that up on the cml.org website later this week under the training materials section. For signing up today and being a participant, you will get an email with that as well. And that really does conclude our webinar today. So I want to say thank you to everyone again and have a great afternoon.